I was the head nurse at the small hospice on Cardogan Walk for 29 years, and I sat at the bedside of perhaps 400 dying men and women in that time. I shall remember, on the last quiet evening I am given, the 7 afternoons in October, the young art student came up the back stairs of the south wing with a paper folder of borrowed music under her arm and played, on the small upright in the dayroom and then later on the Bechstein in the south parlor, the slow movement of Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy for our oldest patient, a composer named Mr. Edwin Caro, 81, who had not been able to speak since the second stroke in August, and who had been listening, by every sign we could read in his bed, for 43 years to a young pupil whose face the world had forgotten, and whose name had been only half remembered in any of the music journals that had ever written about him. I am Mrs. Marjorie Cole, I am 68. The art student was Miss Helena Voss. She was 26. She was in her second year of a master's at the small art school 3 streets from the hospice. She had volunteered through the hospice's small charitable music program for what we call our music afternoons, a weekly afternoon in which a volunteer comes in to play softly for the patients on the dayroom upright. She had been with us 6 weeks before the 7 October afternoons I am about to describe. She had been visiting Mr. Caro on the request of the matron, who had read in the patient's intake notes that he had been a composer. Mr. Edwin Caro had been a small, careful working composer of his generation, not famous, but a long-serving junior staff teacher at the Royal Academy's piano department from his 33rd to his 68th year. He had come into the hospice in his late 70s after the death of his wife of 51 years. He had had his first stroke in May, it had taken his speech, and his second in August, it had taken his right hand. He had not, in 11 weeks since, asked for anything. He had taken his small spoonfuls of soup at lunch and looked out at the courtyard tree. Miss Voss had been told, on her first visit at the end of August, that Mr. Caro had been a composer. She had been told nothing else. The intake notes had been brief. The family had given them in the small, careful handwriting of people who had not themselves known much about the patient's working life. There was no son or daughter. His wife was dead. The flat in Maida Vale had been sold. The personal effects had come into the hospice in 2 small wooden boxes that sat on the wardrobe shelf in his room. The boxes had not, by his own choice or because no one had thought to open them, been unpacked. On her first visit, Miss Voss had brought into his room the small electric keyboard the music program used for the bedside sessions. She had sat on the small visitor's chair beside the bed. She had asked Mr. Caro whether she might play him something. His eyes had moved slightly. The matron who was with her had told her that the eye movement was the patient's small, careful yes. She had played, that first afternoon, 4 small pieces, a Brahms intermezzo, a field nocturne, a small Mendelssohn song without words, and a slow Bach prelude. I had been at the door of the room with the small medication tray. I had watched Mr. Caro's face during the 4 pieces. His face had not changed during the Brahms, the field, or the Mendelssohn. During the Bach prelude, the C major from the first book, his eyes had moved very slightly twice. He had looked at her, he had looked away, he had looked at her again. The second look had lasted perhaps a count of 3. I had thought at the time only that the Bach had pleased him. Miss Voss had come back the following Wednesday afternoon at the same time and had played the same 4 pieces. Mr. Caro's eyes had not changed during any of them. She had come back the Wednesday after that and played a different small selection. The eyes had not changed. On her 4th Wednesday, the first afternoon of October, she had asked the matron whether she could bring in place of the small electric keyboard, the larger paper folder of music she had been working on at the art school. The folder, she explained, contained a piece she had not been able to learn on the small bedside keyboard because the bedside keyboard had a 5-octave range, and the piece required all 7 1/4 of the upright in the dayroom. She had asked the matron whether she might wheel Mr. Caro's bed out into the long south corridor, which had at its far end the small dayroom and the upright, so that he could hear the piece. The matron had cleared it with the duty doctor and with Mr. Caro himself in his small, careful eye movements. The piece in the paper folder, Miss Voss had told the matron when asked, was the slow movement of the Schubert Wanderer Fantasy in C major, the Adagio in C-sharp minor, which she had been working on with her own piano teacher for the previous 9 months. The Wanderer Fantasy is one of the most demanding pieces in the entire piano literature. The slow movement in particular contains a long set of variations on Schubert's earlier song, the Wanderer, variations that move through several keys, demand a very particular kind of singing tone touch, and lay the player open to the listening room in a way few other pieces in the literature do. The 4th Wednesday was the 7th of October. I helped the matron wheel Mr. Caro's bed out into the long south corridor. We angled the bed so that he could see the dayroom door, beyond which Miss Voss had positioned herself at the upright. We left the dayroom door open. Miss Voss began the slow movement. I will tell you, because the story does not work without it, what happened to Mr. Caro's face in the first 30 seconds. The slow movement opens with a quiet single melodic line in the right hand over a soft chordal accompaniment in the left. The melody is the Wanderer theme, the same theme Schubert had used in his earlier song. The theme is one of the most quietly haunting melodies in the entire 19th century piano literature. When Miss Voss began the melody slowly in C-sharp minor with the small private weight of a young pianist who had been learning the piece for 9 months, Mr. Edwin Caro, who had been lying with his eyes half open and his face very still for the 11 weeks since his second stroke, opened his eyes the rest of the way. He kept them open. By the 8th bar his left hand, the hand that had not been paralyzed, lifted slightly from the white hospice sheet. He did not raise it far, he raised it perhaps 2 inches. His fingers moved very slightly in the small careful walking pattern of a piano teacher's left hand, demonstrating, to a small careful pupil, the soft chordal accompaniment of the slow movement. He moved his fingers in time with Miss Voss's left hand. He kept moving them softly 3 inches above the sheet for the next 16 bars. I had been at the side of the bed, I had been watching. I called very quietly for the matron. The matron came, she watched for perhaps a count of 15, she did not interrupt. She put her hand against my arm and did not move it. Miss Voss did not turn round. She did not that afternoon know any of this was happening behind her. She was facing the upright. She was playing the variations. The slow movement of the Wanderer fantasy moves through several variations on the theme. The first variation is a soft figuration in the right hand over the steady left. The second variation moves to a quicker triplet figure. The third variation arrives in C major at one of the most beautiful single passages in the whole Schubert literature. A long rising tender singing line that has, in my private opinion, fewer rivals than any other passage I know. Miss Voss took the C major variation at the tempo Schubert marked. She gave the rising singing line the long unhurried breath it asks for. Mr. Caro, in his bed in the corridor, did the thing I had not, in 29 years of head nursing at the hospice, seen any patient with 2 strokes do. He spoke. He spoke very quietly. He spoke through the small, careful working of his stroke-recovered lips. He said, in the rasp of a man whose voice had not been used in 11 weeks, she is the right pupil. The matron and I looked at each other. Mr. Caro said again, she is the right pupil. She plays the Wanderer the way I taught it. She plays it the way I taught it to Helga. I knew of no Helga in the patient's notes. Miss Voss finished the C major variation. She moved into the final variation, back to C-sharp minor, and the slow climbing returned to the theme. The piece does not so much end as drift back into the silence it came from. She let the last chord settle. She set her hands very gently in her lap. I went very quietly into the dayroom. I knelt at the bench. I said in the small private voice I had used to many small frightened young volunteers across the years, Miss Voss, the patient has spoken. We have to ask you a small thing. Would you sit a moment more at the bench? The patient has said something. I should like to bring you to his bed in the corridor and have you sit at his side and let him say it again to you. Miss Voss came out into the corridor. She knelt at the bedside. Mr. Caro looked at her. His eyes were clear in the way they had not been clear in 11 weeks. He said, Voss, Voss, you are a Voss. She said, yes, Mr. Caro, Helena Voss, I am an art student. I have been playing for you on Wednesdays. He said, Voss, your father was Karl Voss. Yes. She looked at him for a count of perhaps 3 seconds. She said, my grandfather, Mr. Caro. My grandfather was Karl Voss. He died when I was 11. He was a piano teacher in Vienna. He emigrated to England in 1959. He died in 1991. Mr. Caro closed his eyes. He kept them closed for perhaps 8 seconds. When he opened them, they were wet. He said, Karl Voss was my best pupil at the conservatoire in Vienna in 1947. He was 17. I was 37. He was the finest young pianist I had taught in my whole 25 years on the staff. He left for England in 1948 because his family was being moved. I did not know what happened to him. I have not in 78 years known what happened to him. He had played the Wanderer fantasy for me, for the staff examination, the spring before he left. He had played the slow movement the way you have just played it. He played it that way because I had taught him to play it that way. He had played me the C major variation, in particular with the small private weight you have just given it. I had not heard the slow movement played that way in 78 years. I was not, at the upright in the conservatoire in Vienna in 1947, in any doubt of what kind of pianist Karl Voss was going to become. I have wondered every spring of every year since, where Karl Voss had ended up. I have now this October, by the small accident of an art student who happens to be his granddaughter, and who has, on her own initiative, learned the Wanderer fantasy from a Hampstead teacher who is, I would put any small wager on it, a daughter or a pupil of Karl Voss's own teaching and answer. Karl Voss became, as I had hoped he would become, the small, careful teacher of his own daughter and his own granddaughter. The line is unbroken. The Wanderer fantasy is in your hands as it was in his, and as I taught it to him in 1947. I have, in this corridor in October at the Cardogan Walk Hospice, by the grace of God and a small charitable music program, been given back my lost pupil. I am grateful. I am grateful. He closed his eyes again. He smiled. Miss Voss took his left hand in both of hers. She did not for a long minute speak. Then she said very quietly, Mr. Caro, my grandfather lost his teacher's address in the move to England. He spoke of you many times. He did not know your name in writing. He had only the small spoken name, and after the war the records of the Vienna conservatoire were difficult. He used to say to my mother when she was small that he had had one teacher in his life and that he hoped to find the teacher again. He died in 1991 without finding you. He taught my mother piano. He taught me before he died when I was small. My mother teaches me now. The Wanderer fantasy was the piece my grandfather always said had been his examination piece. I learned it because of him. I did not know until 10 minutes ago that the teacher he had been speaking of was you. Mr. Caro opened his eyes. He said in the same rasp, Miss Voss, please, once more, once more. She stood up. She went back to the dayroom. She played the slow movement of the Wanderer fantasy from the beginning. He listened. He kept his eyes open the entire 18 minutes. He spoke nothing more. He did not, by any sign we could read, miss a single bar. When she had finished, he had fallen into a quiet sleep with his left hand still curled in the small, careful walking pattern of a piano teacher's left-hand demonstration. He did not wake until the next morning. She came back every Wednesday for the next 6 weeks. She played the slow movement each time, and after it played whatever small piece Mr. Caro asked her for. He spoke a few more sentences each visit, about Vienna in 1947, about the small, careful spring examination, and finally about a small wrapped photograph in one of the 2 boxes on the wardrobe shelf. We opened the boxes that Wednesday. The photograph was in the second box, wrapped in tissue, a 1947 conservatoire studio print of 3 young men in dark staff examination jackets. The one in the center was Karl Voss, aged 17, with his granddaughter's eyes. Mr. Caro died on the 2nd of December that year, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon at 3:30, while Miss Voss was at the bench in the dayroom playing the slow movement of the Wanderer fantasy. He did not, by the matron's careful account, wake the second to last bar. We had moved his bed back into the long corridor that afternoon by his own small request. Miss Voss did not at first know he had died. The matron and I stood at the side of the bed. We did not interrupt. She finished the movement. She let the last chord settle. She turned. She saw our faces. She came out of the dayroom. She knelt at the bedside. She took his left hand. She kissed the small, careful walking pattern fingers. She said, in the polite, quiet voice she had been using at the bedside for 8 weeks, "Thank you, Mr. Caro. I shall play the Wanderer for my children if I have any. The line will not break." We sat with him for an hour. The matron called the family solicitor. The 2 boxes from the wardrobe shelf came down. There was, in the second box under the wrapped photograph, a small sealed envelope with Miss Helena Voss's name on it in Mr. Caro's hand. The solicitor said the envelope had been added to the boxes by Mr. Caro himself the morning after the first Wednesday, the morning after the day he had first asked Miss Voss whether she was a Voss. The envelope contained, in his careful hand, a short letter and a small private bequest. The letter said, "To Miss Helena Voss, your grandfather was my best pupil. The Wanderer fantasy in your hands is the proof. The small bequest is for the conservatoire scholarship I have been wanting to fund for 30 years and have not, until October, been able to find a name for. Please take it as a bursary for 1 year's serious piano study at any conservatoire of your choosing, in any country. If you do not wish to leave the art school, the bequest is to be given to a young pianist of your own selection on the same terms. Either way, the line is unbroken. E. Caro, Cardogan Walk Hospice, October. The small bequest was substantial. I do not name the figure here. Miss Voss did not, in the end, leave the art school. She finished her master's and gave the bequest, on the terms of the letter, to a young pianist she had selected, a 19-year-old from Manchester her own teacher had called the most quietly serious young pianist I have taught in 15 years. He took the bursary, sat his Royal Academy diploma with the prize for the year, and is now in his 30s giving small recitals across the South. I retired from Cadogan Walk 2 years after the October. The matron gave me, on my retirement, the small studio photograph from May 1947 in a wooden frame the hospice's volunteer carpenter had made. I keep the framed photograph on the small bookcase in my retirement parlor. I look at the 3 young men sometimes on the long, quiet evenings. The young man in the center, Karl Voss, aged 17 in May 1947, has the small, private, steady eyes of a young pianist who has, very recently, been told by his teacher that the slow movement of the Wanderer fantasy is, in fact, the right piece for him. The teacher is not in the photograph. The teacher is, in October 1991, at the small hospice on Cadogan Walk, learning that the line he had thought broken in 1948 has, in fact, run unbroken through 3 generations of a Vienna piano family, and has come, by the small accident of a charitable music program, to a Wednesday afternoon dayroom upright. A hospice can do that on a Wednesday afternoon in October if the dying composer has been listening 78 years for his lost pupil, and the young art student is the granddaughter who learned the Wanderer fantasy 3 generations down the line. The Wanderer does the rest, and the head nurse in 29 years on the South Wing learns at last that the lines we think are broken are sometimes only, very quietly, waiting at a dayroom upright.